Nearly 1 year ago, I made a video talking about my issues with the Five Nights at Freddy's books and why I felt they did more harm than good to the community. And well, things haven't gotten any better since then. Since that video, the community has only become more toxic and hostile over the topic of the books. It is an all-out war on the front lines of Twitter and Reddit. But never fear, the solution is here, because in this video, I'm going to craft the perfect FNAF book series. I'm going to give Scott Cawthon and Scholastic the answer key for the test. I'm going to comb through all of Fazbear literature to truly create the best series of books. So let's hop into our magic ball pit and travel all the way back to December 17th, 2015 when The Silver Eyes was released. When it comes to FNAF books, The Silver Eyes and its trilogy was received well by fans. While in the moment a lot of fans were not loving the fact that it didn't take place in the game's timeline, they got past it. I read the trilogy myself, and I genuinely believe that it's the best piece of FNAF literature to have been released so far. Now, let's dissect what people loved and hated about it. The first and most obvious thing that jumps out at anyone reading this series is that it is a whole story. It's a continuing story with characters that we can attach to. When you compare this trilogy to the Frights and Tales books, the large difference is that the Silver Eyes trilogy gives you characters that you can follow along across these books. From our main character Charlie to her boyfriend John and the series' main villain William Afton. Oh, did I forget to mention that we learn about Purple Guy's name being William Afton in these books? Well, now you know. But the point is, these books give us a view into Charlie and company's journey with Freddy's and battle against the man who won't die, William Afton.
I always come back.
Yeah, but through this journey, we learned shocking things about Charlie Emily, the fact she's a robot, and the crazy advancements in science Afton has made. Another massive pro? In the moment, the trilogy gave us a view into the sci-fi world that Scott had wanted FNAF to go down. It should come as no surprise that Sister Location was Scott flirting with the idea of sci-fi horror. The futuristic and advanced feel that the game has contrasted heavily with some of the previous titles, and this is reflected in the novels. Ever heard of illusion discs? These small discs that could change your view and reality around you originated in the books and were a part of Afton's tech advancements. Here's another one. Were you ever confused as to why the Funtimes were programmed to kidnap kids for Afton? Well, through the trilogy, we learn that Charlie is a robot created by her father to replace the real Charlie who was murdered by Afton. The entire plot of the second and third books is Afton trying to capture Charlie so he can work the same tech magic to save his own daughter. And within the games, a large plot point that we are still trying to decipher is Afton's attempts to revive either his daughter Elizabeth or his son the Crying Child. These books gave us a view into Afton's ambitions, and also what he's like as a person. I mean, while FNAF 6 is a great game, Scraptrap doesn't really represent Afton that well to fans.
I always come back.
Alright, good things aside, what are the flaws of this series? The characters. I know, get your mouse out of the comment section and just hear me out. I did just praise the characters, but my issue isn't with the main characters. Rather, it's with everyone else. John, Charlie, and William Afton are all decently written and I had no major issues with them. But oh boy, these secondary characters, they drive me nuts. More importantly, this guy, Clayburg, the police chief of the town Hurricane, Utah, where everything takes place. He angers me because he has no common sense. Sir, you have giant animatronics killing and murdering people throughout your town, and not once do you call the FBI. Heck, maybe the National Guard. Someone, because whatever you're doing, it ain't working. Personal issues aside, they just aren't that great. But I will cut some slack for Scott and his team, seeing as this was the first series of Fazbear books. So, if I had to take one thing from these books, what would I choose? Without a single shadow of a doubt in my mind, it's the fact that this series was a trilogy. Is this answer lame and boring? Yes, but it's true. These short stories that we get in the Tales and Frights books keep the reader's investment in the stories at a minimum. Also, let's take a look at the games. The FNAF games tell a singular story, therefore a book series trying to give that same experience makes sense for readers. And speaking of the Fazbear Frights, they're up next. The Fazbear Frights were the first books to try the whole short story gimmick. Each book contained 3 stories that took place within the Fazbear Frights universe and included a small epilogue story that was a part of the Stitch Wraith Stingers. While I don't have the time, or patience, to go over every Fazbear Frights story that has been released, I do want to highlight some of the best and worst of the series. And a definite highlight is the story Prankster. This story follows a small game dev studio's experience with the book version of Glitchtrap. Our main character Jeremiah returns to work one day to find his fellow workers' body parts being used to create a nightmare horror show, and he has to play along with a mysterious voices game in order to save them. The story does a great job of creating tension, a likable character, and reintroducing a fan favorite character like Glitchtrap. Another awesome story is named Fetch. This story introduces us to Greg, a teenager teenager who stumbles across a piece of Fazbear tech labeled Fetch in an abandoned pizzeria. Greg quickly learns that Fetch is connected to his phone and that the dog is listening for his request so that he can help Greg. At first, Fetch does something small like retrieving a rubber spider for Greg, but then things get really serious when Fetch murders the neighbor's dog and rips his uncle's finger off his hand. The story ends with Fetch retrieving the girl Greg likes, and let's just say Fetch's definition of retrieving is murdering the poor girl and wrapping her in a bedsheet. Unlike Prankster, Greg is not an amazing main character, but like Prankster, our main antagonist, Fetch is really interesting and steals the show. You read this story because of them. But now it's time for the cons and the reasons why you don't read the frights. While I could dive in and attack some of the truly awful stories in this series, I'd rather attack the problem as a whole. So, the worst part of the Fazbear frights has to be, drumroll please, the pure amount of unadulterated garbage and filth you have to read before you get to the good stories. Wow, that came off a bit harsh, but it's sadly true. When I read all of the Fazbear frights, I experienced what you could call bad story fatigue, and the only way to describe it would be watching 4 of your least favorite movies ever before watching your favorite. At some point, you start to wonder if the whole thing is even worth it, and that's how I felt with the frights. There were whole Fazbear fright books that didn't have a single redeemable story, and that got to me as I was reading. And speaking to some others who have read these books, they share a similar story. Heck, I'm happy I bought all the Fazbear frights at once, because if I didn't, book 8 would have been my last. And that's exactly my problem with the frights. The bad outweighs the good, and it's exhausting to have to read each story knowing there's a high probability that this one will stink. Now, technically speaking, this could have been avoided if the stories were just in a different order, maybe splitting up the good stories so they are more evenly spread. But that's not the point. The point is the bad in this series is truly awful, and it's the reason why fans widely poop on this book series. We can't take this book series seriously when we get stuff like Fazgoo, Gumdrop Angel, and Kids at Play signs in these books. So you're probably wondering how I'm gonna find a positive thing in this book series, but to your surprise, it wasn't that hard. You see, when I sat back and took a look at the series as a whole, I realized that the most profound thing in this book series wasn't the protagonists, but the antagonists. From a robot dog Fetch to a mind-swapping lonely Freddy toy, the real villains in these stories are actually super interesting. Villains like Eleanor, the Afton Amalgamation, Glitchtrap, and even Ralpho are pretty interesting and make these stories worthwhile. Now, to those who are wondering, I count villains as being real threats to the main characters. I'm not talking about stupid stories like Blackbird and 1:35 AM where the main character hallucinates everything and the whole story is a waste of your time. I'm talking about authentic bad guys that make you crave more when the story ends. That's what I'm taking out of the Fazbear frights. Alright, now I'm on the latest piece of Faz books to release, the Tales from the Pizzaplex. These books have been the topic of many heated discussions recently, and the reason is quite simple. These books are too similar to the games. I know, right? It's almost mind-blowing that FNAF books could be criticized for being too similar to the FNAF games, but for the Tales books, it's true. However, this issue isn't unique to the Tales books alone, but it goes all the way back to the Silver Eyes book. So, let's hop back into that time-traveling ball pit and go back to 2015. Now, when the Silver Eyes first hit shelves and people were able to read it, a common complaint arose from the fanbase about the book. People were mad that the book didn't seem to take place in the same continuity as the games. If you look through some of the reviews for the Silver Eyes, you can still see the disappointment from the fans that the books and games weren't explicitly connected. And ever since that point, fans of FNAF have been eagerly waiting for a book series to be in the same continuity as the games. So when Tales from the Pizzaplex came out, fans were dying to connect the Tales books to the recent Steelwool games. And I don't blame them. If I paid nearly $70 for some books, I would try to find a good reason for it.
That'll be $70.
Whoa, that's a lot.
It's $70. So you're buying them?
They're in the same continuity as the games, so it's definitely worth it.
So that's a yes?
Yeah, sadly that's a yes. So what pros are there to be found in the Tales books? There's two, and the first pro is GGY. This story did a great job of providing more backstory as to who Gregory is. It gave us a clear understanding of his connection to the Pizzaplex, and more importantly, Glitchtrap. This story was one of the best examples of a story filling in gaps with the lore. It gave us more info on Gregory, who we didn't know much about, and also explains why Vanny and Glitchtrap are so focused on capturing Gregory. If more stories were like this, I wouldn't have a mental breakdown every time I tried to solve the FNAF lore. So GGY alone is a massive highlight of this series, and is something I hope to see more of in future FNAF books. The second pro has to be the Mimic epilogues. In case you don't know, the epilogue chapters of the Tales from the Pizzaplex series tells the story of a specific Endo that becomes a violent monster. This Mimic Endo was reprogrammed to rip off the limbs of endoskeletons, and it doesn't take long for everything to go wrong and it starts ripping the limbs off of humans. The rest of the epilogues is just the Mimic tearing apart a poor group of teenagers, but it's within these snippets that we are introduced to the concept of the Mimic we see in the Ruin DLC. That is the true highlight of the Tales books. We got a sneak peek of a villain that we would eventually meet in the games. That's something that I have to applaud Scott and the authors for putting together. Alright, that's enough of that, because now it's time to point out the flaws. The Tales books' flaws are very similar to the flaws found in the Fazbear Frights, except here in the Tales books, it's worse. Some of these books seem to have a lot of promise and could be amazing, but they find a way to disappoint. At least with the Frights, I could tell if the story was going to be bad pretty early on. In the Tales books, that realization doesn't hit you till you're halfway in. So like the Fazbear Frights, the real negative of the stories lies in simple math. Bad stories are greater than good stories. With Tales done, it's time to perform this unholy fusion dance and make the perfect Fazbear book series. To recap, from the Silver Eyes trilogy, we take the book structure, a trilogy. From the Fazbear Frights, we take the villains, and from the Tales books, we take its relevance to the games. And with a little bit of Faz magic, we get this. Oh, I guess the Fazbear books were meant to be awful all along. Okay, jokes aside, I believe a return to a more traditional format like a trilogy allows readers to really build a connection and an idea of where this story is taking place. No longer will our minds be forced to clear itself after each story, but instead we'll be able to build our own theories and opinions about what we are reading. And when you add interesting villains like the ones we find in the Frights, you have an opportunity to make something truly worth a reader's time. Now, before I continue, I want to highlight that protagonists are also very important. Sometimes great antagonists need good protagonists to really cement them as being worthwhile. However, when it comes to Five Nights at Freddy's, the villains in this series are what makes the franchise fun. Who wants to hear about the boring night guards when you have William Afton or Ennard trying to kill you? This franchise is a bit different from the norm, and when it comes to writing a compelling FNAF book series, I feel the villains are a vital part of it. So it's time for the final ingredient, lore relevance. While that does sound extremely vague, the point stands. These books need to carry some similarities in characters, villains, or location in order to give readers a real reason to read them. Also, wouldn't that make Scott Scholastic more money? For example, we have a book series following a Fazbear technician who is about to uncover the truth of Fazbear Entertainment. He has a run-in with Vanny, almost gets murdered by the Tangle, and eventually meets the current CEO of Fazbear Entertainment. Within this hypothetical book series, we learn the identity of the CEO, and we learn what the Tangle really is. And if you're worried it's too similar to the games, and we could have a repeat of the Tales books in this hypothetical pizzaplex, there's no Montgomery Gator or Roxanne Wolf. It's just Glamrock Foxy and Glamrock Bonnie. A super clear difference from the games, because when it comes to confusing the books with the games, it's the differences that matter more than the similarities. Well, I hope you enjoyed this journey through Fazbear-themed literature. If you enjoyed, definitely hit the subscribe button for more amazing content. Aside from that, I'll see you guys in the next upload.